I thought I'd found my happily ever after, marrying my partner and starting a new life together. It was as if the world had finally aligned in our favor, and we were ready to take on the world side by side. But little did I know, my mother-in-law was cooking up a plan to disrupt our bliss. At first, she seemed like the perfect mother-in-law, always there to offer a listening ear, a warm hug, or a comforting word. She'd call us every day, just to check in and see how we were doing. Her kindness and generosity made us feel like we'd finally found a true family member. But beneath the surface, I now realize she was seething with a mix of resentment and jealousy. As we started building our life together, she began to subtly infiltrate our decisions. She'd suggest helpful advice on everything from where to buy groceries to how to decorate our new home. At first, we dismissed her opinions as mere motherly concern, but soon we started to feel a creeping sense of unease. Her constant meddling began to chip away at our sense of autonomy, making us question our own choices. It wasn't long before she started to manipulate me emotionally. She'd guilt-trip me into doing favors for her, making me feel like I owed her something. She'd play the victim, claiming that I was neglecting her or not spending enough time with her. Her words would cut deep, making me doubt my own worth. I started to feel like I was caught in a never-ending cycle of emotional blackmail. Meanwhile, she was playing a more sinister game. Behind closed doors, she was whispering in my partner's ear, sowing seeds of doubt about my ability to manage our finances. She'd tell him that I was reckless with money, that I was putting our future at risk. He'd come to me, looking worried and concerned, and I'd try to reassure him that everything was fine. But deep down, I knew that something was off. One day, she made her move. She convinced me to transfer the title of our home into her name, for safekeeping. She promised me that it was just a precaution, that it would protect our property from any potential financial mishaps. I trusted her, and I signed the papers without even thinking twice. Little did I know, I was signing away our future. It wasn't until months later, when I received a call from our bank, that I discovered the truth. Our home had been sold, and the money had been transferred into her account. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was scream. The world around me began to spin out of control. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. My partner and I were at each other's throats, fighting over what had happened. He claimed that he knew nothing about it, that he was just as shocked as I was. But I couldn't shake off the feeling that he'd been in on it all along. As the reality of the situation sunk in, I realized that I'd been living in a state of denial. I'd been so caught up in the idea of being a good daughter-in-law that I'd ignored the warning signs. I'd let her manipulate me, guilt-trip me, and ultimately steal from me. The pain and betrayal I felt were overwhelming. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of despair. But as I looked around me, I saw the devastating impact that her actions had had on our relationship. My partner and I were on the brink of breaking up, and I knew that I had to act fast. I decided to take a stand. I hired a lawyer, and we began the long and arduous process of trying to get our home back. It was a David and Goliath battle, but I was determined to fight for what was rightfully mine. I knew that it wouldn't be easy, but I was willing to do whatever it took to expose the truth and bring her to justice. As I embarked on this journey, I realized that I wasn't just fighting for our home. I was fighting for my own identity, my own sense of self-worth. I was fighting to break free from the toxic grip of my mother-in-law's manipulation and control. It was a battle that would change me forever, but I was ready to face it head-on. In the end, it's not about the house. It's not about the money. It's about the emotional toll that her actions have taken on me. It's about the trust that's been broken, the relationships that have been damaged. It's about the realization that I was living in a state of denial and that I had the power to change my circumstances. As I look back on that perfect storm, I see it for what it was, a carefully crafted plan to manipulate and control me. But I also see the strength that I've found within myself. I see the resilience that I've developed, the courage that I've mustered, and I see the determination that I have to expose the truth, to bring justice to myself, and to protect others from falling victim to her toxic games. In the end, it's not about winning or losing. It's about being honest with myself and with the world. It's about taking responsibility for my actions and for my own happiness. It's about recognizing the warning signs and taking a stand against the forces that seek to control and manipulate us. I still remember the countless times my mother-in-law would call, expressing concern about our financial security. She'd say things like, "You're so young, you don't know how the world works. I'm doing this for your own good." At first, I thought she was just being caring, but looking back, I realized she was manipulating me with guilt. Her words would plant a seed of doubt in my mind, making me question our decisions. She'd say things like, "Why are you spending so much money on that? You should be saving for a rainy day." Or, "You're not thinking about the future. You're just living in the moment." I'd feel guilty for not taking her advice, and before I knew it, I'd be second-guessing myself. I started to feel like I needed her approval to make any decisions. She'd offer to help us with our finances, suggesting we do things her way. "Trust me, I know what I'm doing," she'd say. I'd nod along, thinking I was getting valuable advice, but in reality, she was slowly gaining control over our lives. One day, she called and said, "I've been thinking, and I think it would be best if I held on to the title to our house. That way, I can protect it for you both." I remember feeling a sense of relief, thinking she was looking out for our best interests. But little did I know, she had ulterior motives. She started to make decisions about our home, saying things like, "I'm just trying to make sure everything is taken care of." But what she was really doing was taking control. She'd make decisions about the decor, the gardening, even the renovations. I'd feel frustrated, but she'd just tell me to trust her, that she knew what was best. Looking back, it was a clever manipulation tactic. She'd play on my emotions, making me feel guilty for not trusting her. And before I knew it, she'd have me convinced that she was the only one who truly cared about our well-being. It's a twisted dynamic, but it's one that I fell victim to. As I reflect on those times, I realize that I was so caught up in trying to please her that I lost sight of what was truly important. I was compromising our relationship, our finances, and our home, all because I wanted to avoid the guilt trip she was putting me on. But why did I fall for it? Why did I let her manipulate me so easily? I think it's because I was so desperate to be accepted by her. I wanted to be part of this new family unit, to be loved and accepted for who I was. And she played on that desire, using guilt and manipulation to get what she wanted. It's a hard pill to swallow, but I was complicit in my own downfall. I let her guilt trip me into giving her control of our lives, and in doing so, I lost myself in the process. But that's a story for another time. For now, I just want to acknowledge the guilt trip I was on and how it nearly destroyed me. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of manipulation and the importance of standing up for oneself. As I look back, I realize that I was so blinded by my own emotions that I didn't see the red flags. I didn't see the way she was manipulating me, using guilt to control me. But now I see it clearly, and I'm determined to make sure that I never fall for that again. The question is, how do you recognize a guilt trip when you're in the midst of one? How do you stand up for yourself when someone is manipulating you with guilt? It's a tough question, but one that I'm determined to answer. And as I continue to navigate this journey, I want to ask you, dear viewer, have you ever been on a guilt trip? How did you get out of it? Share your story with me in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. As I move forward, I'm determined to stand up for myself, to be honest with myself, and to never let anyone manipulate me with guilt again. It's a journey that's not easy, but it's one that I'm determined to take, and that's where I'll leave you for now. But before I go, I want to leave you with a question. What would you do if you were in my shoes? Would you stand up for yourself, or would you fall victim to the guilt trip? Let me know in the comments below. I still remember the day she convinced me to transfer the house title into her name, telling me it was all about safekeeping. She said it was to protect our assets from potential lawsuits, that I was being naive to think our bank accounts and investments were enough. I didn't think twice, trusting her and her motives, until it was too late. Looking back, I realize how easy it was for her to manipulate me. She'd always been the one taking care of me, making sure I had everything I needed, and I, in turn, had always looked up to her as a mother figure. It was a toxic dynamic, one that I was blind to at the time. The truth is, I had no idea what she was capable of. I thought she was just trying to help, to protect me from the world's uncertainties. But as I look back now, I see the manipulation for what it was, a clever ploy to gain control over me and my assets. I remember the day she convinced me to sign the deed over to her. It was a typical Tuesday afternoon, and I was feeling stressed about work. She came over, bearing a plate of freshly baked cookies and a concerned expression. "Honey, I just want to make sure you're protected," she said, her voice dripping with sincerity. "You're so young and naive, and the world can be such a cruel place. I just want to make sure you're safe." I, of course, fell for it hook, line, and sinker. I signed the deed over to her, thinking it was the best decision I'd ever made. But little did I know, she had other plans. It wasn't until months later, when I received a letter from the bank informing me that my house had been sold, that I realized what had happened. I was in shock, feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. How could she do this to me? Why had she lied to me? As I sat there, reeling from the news, I couldn't help but think about all the times she'd manipulated me, all the times she'd played on my emotions to get what she wanted. I felt like a fool, realizing how blind I'd been to her true intentions. But as the anger and hurt began to set in, I knew I had to take action. I couldn't just sit back and let her get away with it. I started researching my options, talking to lawyers and financial advisors. And what I found out was nothing short of shocking. Apparently, she'd not only sold the house, but had also used the proceeds to pay off her own debts. I was stunned, feeling like I'd been robbed not just of my home, but of my trust. How could she do this to me? Why had she betrayed me so deeply? As I delved deeper into the situation, I realized that I wasn't just fighting for my home. I was fighting for my freedom. I was fighting to break free from her control, to take back the power that she'd taken from me. It was a daunting task, but I was determined to see it through. And so, I embarked on a journey of legal and emotional warfare, determined to get my home back and to free myself from her grasp. It wouldn't be easy, but I was ready for the challenge. I was ready to take back what was mine, to reclaim my life and my identity. As I looked back on that fateful day when I transferred the deed, I knew that I'd made a mistake. But I also knew that I'd learned from it. I'd learned the importance of trust, the danger of being too trusting, and I'd learned the value of standing up for myself, of fighting for what's rightfully mine. It's a lesson I'll carry with me for the rest of my life, a reminder of the importance of self-love and self-respect. And as I move forward, I know that I'll always be grateful for the journey, no matter how difficult it's been. Because in the end, it's led me to where I am today, stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. I still remember the day I finally got my house back. It was a moment of triumph, a moment of closure. As I walked through the front door, I felt a sense of pride and accomplishment. I'd done it. I'd taken back what was mine. And as I looked around at the familiar surroundings, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I knew that I'd finally broken free from her control, that I'd reclaimed my life and my identity. It was a moment I'll always cherish, a reminder of the power of perseverance and determination. But as I stood there, basking in the glow of victory, I knew that the journey wasn't over yet. I still had to deal with the emotional fallout, the lingering effects of her manipulation. It would take time, patience, and self-love to heal. But I was ready for the challenge. I was ready to move on, to start a new chapter in my life. One where I was in control, where I was the one calling the shots. And as I looked out at the world, I knew that I was ready for anything that came my way. I was ready to take on the world, to face whatever challenges lay ahead with confidence and courage. And that, my friends, is a feeling like no other. It's a feeling of freedom, of empowerment, of being in control of your own life. It's a feeling that I hope you'll experience for yourself. A feeling that I hope will stay with you long after the journey is over. As I look back on the journey, I'm reminded of the importance of self-love and self-respect. I'm reminded of the danger of being too trusting, of letting others take control of our lives. And I'm reminded of the power of perseverance and determination, of standing up for ourselves and fighting for what's rightfully ours. It's a journey that I'll always cherish, a journey that's taught me valuable lessons about myself and about life. And as I move forward, I know that I'll always be grateful for the journey, no matter how difficult it's been. Because in the end, it's led me to where I am today, stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. And that, my friends, is the most beautiful feeling of all. I remember the day I stumbled upon a letter in the mail, addressed to me, with a single sentence that changed everything. The house had been sold to a third party. My heart sank as I read the words, feeling as though I'd been punched in the gut. It was a sensation I'd never experienced before, a mix of shock, panic, and desperation all at once. At first, I thought it was a joke, a cruel prank played on me by someone who knew I'd been worried about the house. But as I read on, my eyes scanning the page for any sign of humor, I realized this was no laughing matter. The letter was official, a notification from the court, stating that my mother-in-law had transferred the title of the house into her name and subsequently sold it to a buyer. I felt like I'd been living in a dream, a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. I kept thinking that I must have done something wrong, that I must have missed a crucial step, a vital piece of information that would have prevented this from happening. But as I looked around my empty apartment, the silence deafening, I knew that I'd been tricked. My mother-in-law had always been manipulative, using guilt and emotional blackmail to get what she wanted. She'd convinced me to transfer the house title into her name, telling me it was all about safekeeping, that she was doing it to protect our assets from potential lawsuits. But now I realized that was just a lie, a cleverly crafted excuse to get her hands on my property. I felt a wave of anger wash over me, followed by a deep sense of sadness. I thought about all the times I'd trusted her, all the times I'd listened to her advice, and how it had all been a ruse. I felt like a fool, a pawn in her game of emotional warfare. As I stood there, frozen in shock, I thought about all the what-ifs. What if I'd never transferred the title? What if I'd been more careful? What if I'd listened to my instincts instead of her words? The questions swirled in my head, a never-ending cycle of regret and self-doubt. But as I looked around my apartment, I knew I had to act. I had to take control of my life, my property, and my future. I had to fight for what was mine, for what I'd worked so hard to achieve. And so, with a newfound sense of determination, I began to plan my next move, a move that would change everything. I started by contacting a lawyer, someone who specialized in property law. I explained the situation to her, and she listened intently, her expression growing more and more serious as I spoke. When I finished, she nodded thoughtfully, her eyes locked on mine. "I think we have a case," she said, her voice firm and confident. "But it won't be easy. We'll need to gather evidence, build a solid argument, and prepare for a long and difficult battle ahead." I nodded, my heart racing with anticipation. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I was ready to fight. I was ready to take back what was mine and to free myself from my mother-in-law's grasp once and for all. As I left the lawyer's office, I felt a sense of hope that I hadn't felt in months. I knew that the road ahead would be long and arduous, but I was ready to face it head on. I was ready to take control of my life and to emerge victorious in the end. But as I walked out into the bright sunlight, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see my mother-in-law standing there, a sly smile spreading across her face. But she was nowhere to be seen, or was she? I shivered, despite the warmth of the sun. I knew that this was just the beginning of a long and twisted journey, a journey that would test my resolve, my courage, and my very soul. But I was ready. I was ready to face whatever lay ahead, and to emerge stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever before. I was consumed by anger, sadness, and a deep sense of betrayal. The emotional fallout was suffocating, and I didn't know how to escape. It was as if I'd been punched in the gut, and the air had been knocked out of me. I couldn't catch my breath, couldn't think straight. The pain was all-consuming, a constant ache that gnawed at my soul. I couldn't understand how someone I trusted so deeply could deceive me so callously. My mother-in-law had been my rock, my confidant, my guiding light. I thought I knew her, thought I understood her. But it turned out I knew nothing. The realization was like a punch to my stomach, a harsh wake-up call that shattered my illusions. I thought back to the day she convinced me to transfer the house title into her name. She'd said it was all about safekeeping, that I was being naive to think our bank accounts and investments were enough. But now it seemed she'd been playing me all along, using her charm and her wit to manipulate me into handing over the keys to my home. It was hard to shake the feeling that I'd been blind, that I'd ignored the warning signs and trusted someone who didn't deserve it. I replayed our conversations in my head, searching for clues, for hints that I might have missed. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I'd been blinded by my love for my husband, by my desire to please her. I remember the day I stumbled upon the letter in the mail, addressed to me, with a single sentence that changed everything. The house had been sold to a third party. My heart sank as I read the words, feeling as though I'd been punched in the gut all over again. It was a punch that never seemed to land, never seemed to subside. I felt like I was stuck in a nightmare, a never-ending cycle of pain and betrayal. As the days passed, the anger and sadness gave way to a deeper sense of loss. I lost my home, my sense of security, my trust in others. I felt like I was walking through a minefield, never knowing when the next explosion would come. I was trapped in a world of uncertainty, a world where nothing seemed certain, where nothing seemed safe. I tried to talk to my husband, to explain how I felt, but he was distant, detached. He said he didn't know what to say, that he was caught in the middle. But I knew he knew more than he was letting on. I knew he'd been in on it from the beginning, that he'd been complicit in my mother-in-law's deception. The thought of it was like a knife to my heart, a constant reminder of the pain and the betrayal. I felt like I was losing myself, like I was disappearing into the darkness of my own despair. I didn't know how to escape, didn't know how to find my way back to the light. As the days turned into weeks, the weeks turned into months, I began to realize that I wasn't alone. I had friends, family members, people who cared about me and wanted to help, but I pushed them away, afraid of their sympathy, afraid of their judgment. I was trapped in my own world, a world of pain and anger and sadness. It took me a long time to come to terms with what had happened, to accept the reality of the situation. It took me a long time to realize that I wasn't to blame, that I'd been a victim of my own love and trust. It took me a long time to find my way back to myself, to rediscover my sense of purpose and my sense of self. But eventually, I did. I started to heal, to rebuild my life, to find my way back to the light. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I had to let go of the past, to release the anger and the sadness. I had to forgive myself, forgive my husband, forgive my mother-in-law. It was a long and difficult journey, but it was one I had to take. I had to find my way back to myself, to rediscover my sense of self and my sense of purpose. I had to learn to trust myself, to trust others, to trust the process of healing and growth, and in the end, it was worth it. I emerged from the darkness, into the light, into a world of possibility and promise. I emerged stronger, wiser, more resilient than ever before. I emerged with a newfound sense of self, a sense of purpose, and a sense of direction. But the journey was far from over. There were still battles to fight, still wars to be won. There were still wounds to heal, still scars to reveal. But I was ready, I was strong, I was determined, and so I stood up, I took a deep breath, and I began to walk into the unknown. I walked into a world of uncertainty, a world of possibility, a world of promise. I walked into a world where anything could happen, where anything was possible. And as I walked, I felt a sense of freedom, a sense of liberation. I felt like I was finally free. Free from the past, free from the pain, free from the anger. Free to be myself, to live my life, to follow my dreams. And as I walked, I knew that I would never be the same again. I knew that I would always carry the scars of the past, but I also knew that I would always be stronger, wiser, and more resilient than ever before. I knew that I would always be a warrior of the heart, a warrior of the soul. And so I walked on into the unknown, into the light, into the world of possibility and promise. I walked on with a sense of purpose, with a sense of direction, with a sense of self. I walked on with a heart full of hope, with a soul full of joy. I began to see the pattern of manipulation, the guilt trips, and the emotional blackmail. It was like a slow-motion replay of all the times my mother-in-law, or Maëlle as I'd come to think of her, had somehow managed to get me to do exactly what she wanted. At first, it was just little things, asking me to pick up something for her, or running errands for her. But over time, I started to notice a trend. She'd always be there, lurking in the background, making me feel guilty for not doing enough for her. It was like I was walking around with this invisible weight on my shoulders, constantly wondering what I'd done wrong. And every time I tried to push back, to tell her that I couldn't do this or that, she'd somehow managed to guilt me into submission. It wasn't until I stumbled upon the letter that I realized just how far her manipulation had gone. She'd convinced me to transfer the title of my house into her name, supposedly for safekeeping. What I didn't know was that she was planning to use it as collateral for one of her own business deals. And when I found out that she'd sold it behind my back, I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. But as I looked back on all the times she'd manipulated me, I realized that it wasn't just about her helping me out. It was about exerting control over our lives. She'd never been happy with the fact that I was making my own decisions, taking care of myself, and being independent. And so, she'd found ways to chip away at that, to make me feel small and insignificant. I remembered the countless times she'd called me, crying and whining about how I wasn't doing enough for her. And every time I'd felt like I was walking on eggshells, never knowing what would set her off next. I'd tried to set boundaries, to tell her that I couldn't do this anymore, but she'd just find new ways to guilt-trip me into submission. But something had changed inside of me. I'd hit a breaking point, and I knew I couldn't take it anymore. I realized that I'd been living in a state of constant fear, always wondering what she'd do next, what she'd say next. And I knew that I had to take back control. It wasn't going to be easy. I knew that she'd fight hard to keep me under her thumb, to keep me in a state of constant fear and submission. But I was determined to fight back. I was determined to take back what was rightfully mine, to stand up for myself and assert my independence. I started by doing some research, trying to understand the laws and regulations surrounding property ownership. I wanted to know what my rights were, what my options were. And as I delved deeper into the world of real estate law, I realized just how complicated it was. but I was determined to learn, to educate myself. I spent hours poring over books and articles, watching webinars and attending seminars. I talked to lawyers and real estate agents, trying to get a better understanding of the system, and slowly but surely, I started to feel a sense of empowerment. I realized that I wasn't just fighting for my house, I was fighting for my freedom. I was fighting for the right to make my own decisions, to live my own life, without the constant weight of my mill's manipulation hanging over me. And with every step I took, with every decision I made, I felt myself growing stronger, more confident. It wasn't going to be an easy battle, but I was ready. I was ready to take on my Auntie-Mae, to stand up for myself and to fight for what was rightfully mine. And as I looked to the future, I knew that I'd emerge victorious, stronger, and more resilient than ever before. I started researching, gathering information, and seeking advice from experts. It was a daunting task, but I knew I had to understand the extent of my mother-in-law's deception and the legal implications of her actions. I spent hours poring over online forums, scouring the internet for answers, and consulting with lawyers who specialized in property law. As I delved deeper into the world of real estate law, I began to realize the gravity of the situation. My mother-in-law had not only sold my property without my consent, but she had also taken steps to ensure that I would not be able to recover it. It was a complex web of deceit, and I was starting to feel like I was trapped in a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. I spent countless nights lying awake, my mind racing with thoughts of how I had let this happen. Why had I been so blind to her manipulation? Why had I trusted her so completely? The questions swirled in my head like a maelstrom, each one fueling a deep sense of anger and betrayal. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to see the situation in a different light. I realized that I was not alone in this fight. There were countless others out there who had been similarly victimized by their loved ones, and they had found ways to reclaim their properties and their lives. I began to see myself as part of a larger community, a community of survivors who were determined to take back control. With newfound determination, I vowed to fight for my property and my independence. I started making phone calls, scheduling meetings with lawyers, and gathering evidence to build a case against my mother-in-law. It was a daunting task, but I was no longer afraid. I was angry, and I was determined to see justice served. As I walked through the streets, I felt a sense of purpose that I had not felt in years. I was no longer just a victim. I was a warrior fighting for my rights and my dignity. I knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but I was ready for the challenge. I was ready to face my mother-in-law, to confront her about her actions, and to demand that she return my property. But as I stood at the crossroads, I couldn't help but feel a sense of uncertainty. What would happen if I lost? What if I couldn't afford to pay the lawyers? What if my mother-in-law had planned more tricks up her sleeve? The questions swirled in my head like a vortex, each one fueling a growing sense of anxiety. And yet I knew that I had to push on. I had to see this through, no matter what. I had to fight for my property, for my freedom, and for my self-respect. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and stepped forward into the unknown. It was a moment of truth, a moment that would change my life forever. As I walked into the lawyer's office, I felt a sense of trepidation. Would he be able to help me? Would he believe me? The questions swirled in my head like a maelstrom, each one fueling a growing sense of uncertainty. But I pushed them aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. "Okay," I said, my voice steady. "Let's do this." The lawyer smiled, his eyes sympathetic. "We'll get through this together," he said. "But first, we need to understand the situation. Can you tell me exactly what happened?" I took a deep breath, launching into the story of my mother-in-law's deception. The words tumbled out of me like a torrent, each one building on the last to create a narrative of betrayal and heartbreak. The lawyer listened intently, his eyes never leaving mine. When I finished, he nodded thoughtfully. "I see," he said. "Well, let's start by gathering evidence. We'll need to talk to witnesses, review documents, and perhaps even hire a private investigator." I nodded, feeling a sense of hope that I had not felt in weeks. Maybe, just maybe, I had a chance to reclaim my property, to take back my life. Maybe I could finally break free from my mother-in-law's grasp and start anew. But as I left the lawyer's office, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in for a long and difficult fight. I had no idea what lay ahead, no idea what challenges I would face or what obstacles I would overcome. But I was ready, armed with a determination that I had never felt before. I was ready to fight for my property, for my freedom, and for my self-respect. And I was ready to take on my mother-in-law, no matter what it took. I walked into the kitchen that day, feeling a mix of exhaustion and determination. The battle lines were drawn, and I was ready to fight. My mother-in-law, or Mill, had been relentless in her pursuit to get her hands on my house. She'd been making empty promises, playing the victim, and manipulating my emotions to get what she wanted. But I knew the truth. She was a master manipulator, using every trick in the book to get her way. As I poured myself a cup of coffee, I couldn't help but think about the conversation we'd had the night before. She'd shown up uninvited, bearing a plate of fresh-baked cookies and a smile that could charm the devil himself. But beneath the surface, I knew she was seething with anger and resentment. She'd been trying to get me to sign over the title to my house for months. And I'd finally had enough. "I don't know why you're being so stubborn." "Honey," she'd said, her voice dripping with innocence, "I just want to help you secure your future." But I knew better. I knew she wanted to control me, to own me, and to take away my independence. And I was determined to stop her. But the battle ahead of me was far from easy. My Mill would stop at nothing to silence me, using every tactic in the book to discredit me and gain the upper hand. She'd been calling my husband, trying to turn him against me, and even going so far as to send him texts and emails, accusing me of being paranoid and unstable. But I refused to back down. I knew I was right, and I was willing to fight for what was mine. The days that followed were a blur of anxiety and stress. I felt like I was walking on eggshells, never knowing when my Emil would strike next. She'd show up at my doorstep, bearing gifts and apologies, but always with an ulterior motive. She'd call me, pretending to be concerned about my well-being, but really just trying to get me to let my guard down. But I was no fool. I knew her game, and I was determined to outsmart her. One day I received a call from a neighbor who'd seen my MIL lurking around my house. She'd been snooping around, trying to get a glimpse of my property and making a big show of it like she was doing me a favor. I felt a surge of anger and frustration, but I took a deep breath and tried to calm down. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of getting a rise out of me. Instead, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I started documenting everything. Every conversation, every text message, every email. I was determined to prove that she was the one who'd been manipulating me and that I was the victim, not the perpetrator. And I was going to take her down, no matter what it took. As the battle raged on, I felt like I was losing myself in the process. I was constantly on edge, never knowing when my MIL would strike next. But I refused to give up. I knew that I was fighting for my freedom, for my independence, and for my right to live my life the way I wanted to. And I was determined to win. But the emotional warfare was taking a toll on me. I felt like I was walking through a minefield, never knowing when I'd step on a landmine and blow up. My relationships with my friends and family were suffering, and I was starting to feel like I was living in a war zone. But I knew that I couldn't give up. I had to keep fighting, no matter what. And so I dug deep, finding a strength and determination that I never knew I had. I started to see my Mill for what she was, a master manipulator using every trick in the book to get what she wanted. and I was determined to expose her, to take her down, and to free myself from her control. The battle was intense, with both of us digging in our heels, refusing to give up. But I knew that I had the upper hand. I had the truth on my side, and I was determined to use it to my advantage. And as I looked out the window, watching my Miel's car drive away, I felt a sense of hope and determination that I hadn't felt in weeks. I was going to win this battle, no matter what it took. I was going to take back my life, my independence, and my freedom. And I was going to make sure that my Miel never manipulated me again. I'll never forget the day I stumbled upon the document that changed everything. It was as if a weight had been lifted off my shoulders and the fog had finally cleared. I had been searching for answers, poring over records and consulting with experts, but nothing seemed to add up. My mother-in-law, or Miel, had been playing a clever game of cat and mouse, always staying one step ahead of me. But this document, it was different. It was like a master key that unlocked the entire puzzle. I remember holding it in my hands, feeling the paper tremble as my fingers touched it. The words on the page seemed to jump out at me, screaming the truth. My Miel had been secretly planning to take control of my house all along. The more I read, the more my heart sank. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut, left gasping for air. How could she do this to me, to us? The thought of her manipulating me, using her guilt trips and empty promises to get what she wanted, made my blood boil. But as I delved deeper into the document, I realized that I had stumbled upon something much bigger than just a simple case of family drama. This was about power, control, and manipulation. My Miel had been playing a game of psychological warfare, using every trick in the book to get what she wanted. I felt a chill run down my spine as I thought about all the times she'd made me feel guilty. All the times she'd whispered sweet nothings in my ear, making me doubt myself. It was all a lie, a clever web of deceit spun by a master manipulator. The more I learned, the more I realized that I had been living in a state of denial. I had been so caught up in trying to please everyone, to keep the peace, that I had ignored the warning signs. But now, with the truth staring me in the face, I knew I had to take action. I couldn't just sit back and let my Miel continue to control me. I had to stand up for myself, for my life, for my home. The thought of it sent a surge of determination coursing through my veins. I was done being a pawn in her game. With the document in hand, I felt a newfound sense of confidence. I knew that I had the upper hand now, and that my Miel's days of manipulation were numbered. I was ready to fight, to take back control of my life and my home. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. I gathered my strength, my courage, and my wits, and I prepared to face my Miel in the battle of a lifetime. I knew it wouldn't be easy, that there would be twists and turns, ups and downs. But I was ready. I was ready to confront the truth, to face the reality of my situation. I was ready to stand up for myself, to fight for what was rightfully mine. And I was ready to win. As I looked back on the journey that had brought me to this point, I realized that it had been a journey of self-discovery. I had learned so much about myself, about my strengths and weaknesses, my fears and doubts. And I had learned that I was stronger than I ever thought possible. I had learned that I was capable of facing my fears, of standing up to my enemies, of fighting for what I believed in. And I had learned that I was worthy of love, of respect, of dignity. As I stood tall, ready to face the challenges ahead, I knew that I would emerge victorious. I would take back my life, my home, and my dignity. And I would never let anyone, including my Miel, take that away from me again. The battle was far from over, but I was ready. I was ready to fight, to win, and to take back control of my life. And I knew that I would never be the same again. I'll never forget the day I hired a lawyer, the weight of my mother-in-law's deceit finally settling on me like a physical burden. It was as if I'd been carrying a heavy backpack for months, and suddenly I'd found the strength to lay it down. I remember walking into the lawyer's office, my mind racing with questions and doubts. Was I doing the right thing? Was I ready for the battle ahead? My lawyer, Rachel, greeted me with a warm smile and a firm handshake. She listened intently as I poured out my story, my emotions spilling over like a dam breaking. She nodded sympathetically, her eyes never leaving mine, as I recounted every detail of my mother-in-law's manipulation. I told her about the promises, the guilt trips, the empty threats, and the silent condemnations. I told her about the document I'd discovered, the proof I needed to take my mother-in-law to court. Rachel's expression changed from sympathetic to determined. She patted the armchair beside her and said, "Let's get down to business." And that's exactly what we did. We spent the next few hours discussing strategies, outlining our case, and preparing for the war that was to come. I remember feeling a sense of hope, a glimmer of light in the darkness. Maybe, just maybe, I could take back control of my life and my property. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months. Our battle with my mother-in-law was intense, with both sides exchanging blows and neither willing to give in. We discovered some surprising evidence, some crucial documents that would help our case, but my mother-in-law was relentless. She'd hired her own lawyer, a sly and cunning man who seemed to delight in my misery. The courtroom was a battleground, a place where two armies clashed in a war of words and documents. Rachel and I stood strong, our arguments clear and concise, but my mother-in-law's lawyer was a master of manipulation. He twisted my words, distorted the truth, and made me feel like a liar. I remember feeling like I was drowning in a sea of deceit, my emotions swirling with anger, fear, and frustration, but Rachel was my rock, my guiding light in the darkness. She kept me focused, encouraged me to stay the course, and reminded me of the truth. We worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, consulting with experts, and preparing for every possible outcome. And slowly, incrementally, we began to build a case that would change everything. It wasn't easy, of course. There were long nights, sleepless days, and moments of pure desperation. But I refused to give up. I knew that I was fighting for something bigger than just my house, something more profound than just my freedom. I was fighting for my dignity, my self-respect, and my right to live my life without interference. As the trial drew near, the tension mounted. My mother-in-law's lawyer would stop at nothing to win, and I knew that I had to be just as determined. Rachel and I prepared for every eventuality, our strategies and tactics honed to perfection. We knew that the outcome was far from certain, but we were ready for whatever came next. The day of the trial arrived, and I felt like I was walking into a storm. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation and tension. Rachel and I stood tall, our heads held high, as we faced the judge and the opposing lawyer. My mother-in-law was nowhere to be seen, but her presence hung in the air like a specter, a constant reminder of the battle we'd fought and the war we'd won. The judge's words still echo in my mind. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff, your name. Your house is returned to you, and your mother-in-law's actions are deemed null and void. I remember feeling like I'd been punched in the gut, like all the air had been sucked out of my lungs. I looked at Rachel, tears streaming down my face, and I knew that we'd done it. We'd won. But as I looked around the courtroom, I saw the faces of the people I loved, the people who'd supported me through this long and arduous journey. I saw the fear in their eyes, the uncertainty and the doubt, and I knew that I had to be strong for them, for myself, and for the future. As we left the courtroom, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. It was as if I'd finally found my way out of the darkness, into the light. I knew that I still had a long way to go, that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges and obstacles. But I was ready. I was ready to rebuild my life, to rediscover myself, and to find my true voice. It's hard to put into words the emotional toll that court battle took on me. The constant back and forth, the endless paperwork, the weight of uncertainty that hung over me like a dark cloud. I remember the nights I'd lie awake, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Would I ever see the light of day? Or would I be trapped in this never-ending cycle of court dates and negotiations? I felt like I was drowning in a sea of paperwork and bureaucratic red tape. Every document, every contract, every court order seemed to be a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit together. And yet, I was determined to find a way to make it work. I scoured the internet for advice, consulted with experts, and pored over stacks of books on real estate law. I was a sponge, soaking up every bit of information I could find, desperate to stay one step ahead of my mother-in-law's lawyers. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling of desperation that had settled over me. It was like I was trapped in a nightmare and I couldn't wake up. The court dates seemed to drag on forever, each one a reminder that I was still stuck in this never-ending cycle. And my mother-in-law, she was always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to pounce on any weakness she could find. I remember one particularly brutal court date, where my mother-in-law's lawyers had managed to dig up some old document that seemed to contradict everything I'd been saying. I was caught off guard, and for a moment, I felt like I'd been punched in the gut, but something inside of me clicked, and I knew I couldn't give up. I took a deep breath, and I stood up to them, refusing to back down. It was a turning point, a moment of clarity that I'd been searching for. I realized that I didn't have to be held hostage by my mother-in-law's manipulation and guilt trips. I could stand up for myself and fight for what was rightfully mine, and so I did. I dug deep, drawing on a well of resilience and determination that I never knew I had. It wasn't easy, of course. There were still countless court dates, endless negotiations, and moments of pure despair. But I refused to give up, no matter how dark things seemed. I kept pushing forward, fueled by a fierce determination to reclaim my property and my independence. And slowly but surely, things began to turn around. The court dates started to go in my favor, and my mother-in-law's lawyers began to falter. I could see the frustration in their eyes, the realization that they'd underestimated me. And I knew in that moment that I was going to win. I was going to get my property back, and I was going to be free. But even as I looked to the future, I couldn't shake the memories of those dark nights. The weight of uncertainty, the feeling of being trapped, the desperation that had threatened to consume me. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's always hope, and it's a lesson that I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. I'll never forget the day a breakthrough finally came in my fight to reclaim my home. It was like a ray of sunshine breaking through the dark clouds that had been suffocating me for months. My lawyer walked into the room, a hint of a smile on his face, and I could tell by the look in his eyes that something was about to change. "Your mother-in-law's defenses are crumbling," he said, his voice filled with a mix of excitement and caution. "A key witness has come forward, providing testimony that could blow the whole case wide open." I felt a surge of adrenaline course through my veins as I listened to his words. Could it be true? Was this really the turning point I'd been waiting for? I remember thinking back to all the sleepless nights, the endless worries, and the crushing weight of uncertainty that had been holding me back. Was it finally going to lift? The witness in question was a former employee of my mother-in-law's. He'd been working for her for years and had grown close to her during that time. But as he began to testify, it became clear that he was no fan of hers. In fact, he seemed to have a deep-seated dislike for her, and his words dripped with venom. She was always manipulating people, he said, his voice dripping with disdain. She'd use guilt and fear to get what she wanted. And when she didn't get it, she'd turn on you like a snake. I felt a chill run down my spine as I listened to his words. This was the woman I'd married into, the woman I'd trusted with my home and my heart. And yet, here I was, listening to a stranger paint a picture of her that was almost too horrific to believe. But as the witness continued to testify, I began to piece together a puzzle that had been hidden from me for years. It was clear now that my mother-in-law had been playing a long game, using her charm and her cunning to manipulate those around her and get what she wanted. And what she wanted was my home. I felt a wave of anger wash over me as I listened to the witness's words. How could she do this to me? To us? To our family? I thought back to all the conversations we'd had, all the times I'd trusted her with my deepest fears and insecurities. And all the while, she'd been playing me like a pawn in her twisted game of chess. But this was more than just a game, I realized. This was about power, this was about control, and this was about the very foundation of my family's relationships. As the witness finished his testimony, I felt a sense of determination wash over me. I was going to fight for my home, for my family, and for the truth. And I was going to do it with every ounce of strength I had. My lawyer looked at me, a nod of encouragement on his face. "We're going to win this," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "We're going to take back what's yours, and we're going to make sure that your mother-in-law pays for what she's done." I felt a surge of hope rise up within me. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of the end. Maybe this was the moment when I would finally be free from my mother-in-law's grasp, and I could start to rebuild my life. But as I looked into my lawyer's eyes, I saw something there that gave me pause. A glimmer of doubt, a flicker of uncertainty. "It's not going to be easy," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're going to have to fight for every inch, every scrap of evidence, every shred of credibility." I nodded, my heart sinking. I knew it wouldn't be easy. I knew that this was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey. But I also knew that I was ready. I was ready to fight, to struggle, and to claw my way back to the life I deserved. And so, with a newfound sense of determination, I stood up, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. I was ready to take back my home, to reclaim my family, and to expose the truth about my mother-in-law's deceit. As I walked out of the room, I felt a sense of purpose wash over me. I was no longer just a victim of my mother-in-law's manipulation. I was a warrior, a fighter, and a survivor, and I was going to do whatever it took to win this battle, and to emerge victorious in the end. But little did I know, the real challenge was only just beginning. It was the day of reckoning, the moment of truth that had been looming over me for months. I stood outside the courtroom, my heart racing with anticipation as I prepared to face off against my mother-in-law in a battle for control of my own home. The tension was palpable, a thick fog that hung in the air like a challenge, daring us to take the next step. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the butterflies that had been fluttering in my stomach since dawn. This was it, the moment of truth. The outcome hung in the balance, and I held my breath as I pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped into the cold, sterile atmosphere of the courtroom. The room was dimly lit, the only sound the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. My mother-in-law sat across from me, her eyes fixed intently on the judge, a look of determination etched on her face. I felt a shiver run down my spine as our eyes met, a spark of animosity flashing between us like a challenge. The judge, a kind-faced woman with a gentle smile, looked up from the papers in front of her and nodded for us to begin. My lawyer, a seasoned veteran with a calm and confident demeanor, stood up and began to outline our case. My mother-in-law's lawyer, a slick and polished man with a silver tongue, countered with a slick and convincing argument of his own. The battle was on, each of us determined to emerge victorious. I felt my nerves begin to fray, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios as the stakes grew higher and higher. But I refused to back down, drawing on every ounce of strength and determination I possessed to keep fighting for what was rightfully mine. The hours ticked by, each minute feeling like an eternity as we battled on, each of us digging in our heels and refusing to yield. The tension in the room grew thicker and thicker, a palpable force that seemed to vibrate through every molecule of air. And then, suddenly, it was over. The judge nodded, her eyes scanning the room before coming to rest on me. "The verdict is in," she said, her voice calm and detached. "You, the plaintiff, have won the case." I felt a surge of emotion, a mix of relief and elation that threatened to overwhelm me. I stood up, my heart racing with excitement, as the judge continued to speak. "You are hereby awarded full ownership of the property in question, effective immediately." My mother-in-law's face turned white with rage, her eyes blazing with anger and betrayal. But I just smiled, feeling a sense of vindication wash over me. I had done it. I had fought for what was mine and come out on top. As I walked out of the courtroom, my head held high, I felt a sense of pride and accomplishment that I had never felt before. I had faced my fears, stood up for myself, and emerged victorious. I knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in my life, one in which I would be free to make my own decisions, to live my own life, without the suffocating grip of my mother-in-law's control. But as I looked over at my mother-in-law, who was storming out of the courtroom, her face twisted with anger and hurt, I felt a pang of sadness. I knew that this wasn't the end of our battle, not by a long shot. There would be more fights, more struggles, more moments of tension and conflict. But I was ready. I was ready to face whatever lay ahead, to stand up for myself and fight for what was mine. I was ready to be free. As I walked out of the courtroom into the bright sunlight, I felt a sense of hope and renewal that I had never felt before. I knew that I had a long and difficult road ahead of me, but I was ready. I was ready to take back control of my life, to make my own decisions, to live my own life. And as I looked out at the world around me, I knew that I would never be the same again. I had been tested, tried, and found worthy. I had emerged victorious, and I knew that I would never let anyone take that away from me again. As I stood outside the courtroom, the cool morning air, a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing inside me, I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. The verdict had been read, and I'd emerged victorious, regaining control over my property. The sense of vindication was overwhelming, a testament to my strength and determination in the face of overwhelming odds. I remember the countless nights spent poring over documents, researching laws, and preparing for the long, arduous battle ahead. It was a fight that tested my resolve, pushed me to my limits, and forced me to confront the darkest corners of my own psyche. But I'd never given up, even when it seemed like the universe was conspiring against me. The courtroom had been a whirlwind of emotions, a maelstrom of intensity that left me breathless. My mother-in-law's face, a picture of defiance and anger, still lingered in my mind. The way she'd spat venom at me, the venomous words that had cut deep, the accusations that had left me reeling. It was all still so vivid. But in that moment, as I stood outside, bathed in the warm sunlight, I felt a sense of freedom wash over me. It was as if I'd finally shrugged off the weight of her manipulation, the suffocating grip she'd held on me for so long. I was taking back control, reclaiming my life, and forging a new path that was mine alone to walk. The days that followed were a blur of activity, a whirlwind of activity as I worked to undo the damage that had been done. It was a painstaking process, one that required patience, persistence, and a willingness to confront the harsh realities of my situation. But with each passing day, I felt myself growing stronger, more resilient, more determined. I began to see my mother-in-law in a new light, a complex web of emotions and motivations that I'd never fully understood before. It wasn't just about getting my property back. It was about shattering the illusion that had been created, about exposing the web of deceit and manipulation that had nearly destroyed me. As I worked to rebuild my life, I started to realize just how much I'd lost. The sense of trust, the feeling of security, the knowledge that I was in control of my own destiny. It was all gone, replaced by a deep-seated fear and a nagging sense of uncertainty. But I refused to let that define me. I refused to let her win. Instead, I chose to focus on the positives, on the growth and the lessons that had emerged from this nightmare. I started to see myself in a new light, as a survivor, a warrior, a person who'd faced the darkest depths of human nature and emerged stronger, wiser and more resilient. The months that followed were a journey of self-discovery, a journey that took me to the depths of my own soul. I began to confront the fears and doubts that had held me back for so long, to challenge the negative self-talk that had nearly destroyed me. I started to see the world in a new light, a world full of possibility and promise, where anything was possible and nothing was beyond my reach. And as I looked back on the journey that had brought me to this place, I felt a sense of pride and accomplishment wash over me. I'd fought against the odds and emerged victorious. I'd reclaimed my property, my life, and my sense of self. I'd shattered the illusion that had nearly destroyed me and emerged stronger, wiser, and more resilient. It was a journey that had changed me forever, a journey that had taught me the value of perseverance, the power of determination, and the importance of never giving up. And as I stood there basking in the warm sunlight, I knew that I was ready for whatever lay ahead, ready to face the challenges of life with courage, confidence, and a sense of purpose. As I stood outside the courtroom, the cool morning air a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing inside me, I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. The verdict had been read, and I'd emerged victorious, regaining control over my property. The sense of vindication was overwhelming, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this journey had changed me in ways I was still discovering. I thought back to the day when my mother-in-law had first approached me with her proposal. She'd been so charismatic, so persuasive, that I'd found myself swept up in her vision for our family's future. But as the months went by, I began to realize that I'd been duped. She'd manipulated me into transferring the title of my property into her name, all under the guise of safekeeping. The thought sent a shiver down my spine as I recalled the feeling of powerlessness that had washed over me. It was a feeling I'd grown all too familiar with over the years. My mother-in-law had always been the dominant force in our family, and I'd often found myself cowering in her presence. But this time, I'd finally found the courage to stand up for myself. The courtroom had been a proving ground, and I'd emerged scarred but wiser. As I walked away from the courthouse, the sun beating down on my face, I felt a sense of freedom that I'd never known before. It was as if I'd finally broken free from the chains that had bound me for so long. I'd fought for what was rightfully mine, and in doing so, I'd found myself. The thought sent a surge of emotion through me, and I felt a lump form in my throat. I'd come a long way from the timid, uncertain person I'd once been. I'd discovered a strength within myself that I never knew I had, and it was a feeling that I knew I'd carry with me for the rest of my life. Looking back, I realized that my mother-in-law's manipulation had been a catalyst for change. It had forced me to confront my own weaknesses and limitations and to find the courage to stand up for myself. And as I looked to the future, I knew that I'd never again be held captive by the manipulation and control of others. I thought about the lessons I'd learned along the way, the hard-won wisdom that had been forged in the fire of adversity. I'd learned to trust myself, to listen to my own voice, and to stand up for what I believed in. And I'd learned that true freedom came not from avoiding challenges, but from facing them head-on. As I walked through the quiet streets, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the buildings, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I knew that I'd never be the same person again, that I'd been forever changed by the experience. And in a strange way, I was grateful for that. For the first time in my life, I felt truly alive, truly free. And as I looked to the horizon, I knew that I was ready for whatever lay ahead. I was no longer the timid, uncertain person I'd once been. I was stronger, wiser, and more resilient than I ever thought possible. And as I disappeared into the crowd, I felt a sense of hope rising up within me. Hope that I'd never again be held back by the limitations of others. Hope that I'd always stand up for myself no matter what the cost. And hope that I'd continue to grow, to learn, and to thrive in the years to come. The feeling was intoxicating, and I felt myself smiling as I walked away from the courthouse. I'd finally found my freedom, and I knew that I'd never let it go.